Hello and welcome to Mythmakers. Mythmakers is the podcast for fantasy fans and fantasy creatives brought to you by the Oxford Centre for Fantasy. My name is Julia Golding. Now today I want to share with you a very special evening we ran last year to recreate an Inklings event. We did this in the beautiful surroundings of Merton College, Oxford, where Tolkien was a professor at the end of his life. Of course, the Inklings actually more normally met at Magdalen College, which is just over the road from Merton. And it is there that we start this presentation because the person who holds the seat that Lewis held in his day, Professor Simon Horobin, spoke to us in his room, which is a few doors down from where C.S. Lewis used to host the Inklings.
I'm Simon Horobin, and I'm a fellow and tutor in English here at Magdalen College.
And I believe you hold a particularly significant office.
That's right. I'm lucky enough to have the job that C.S. Lewis himself had when he was here, and not quite in the same rooms as him, but in the same building.
So you've been working on a book about C.S. Lewis. So can you tell us, how did Tolkien and C.S. Lewis first meet?
So they first met in 1926 at a meeting of the English faculty. And they'd both actually recently joined the English faculty. Lewis had been in Oxford before, but he'd just got his job here at Magdalen. And Tolkien had just arrived as the new Rawlinson and Bosworth Professor of Anglo-Saxon from Leeds University. And they met there at a meeting where they were discussing syllabus reform, a rather dry topic, but actually it was quite heated. Because there was a lot of antagonism between the English literature side of the course and the English language people. And Tolkien and Lewis found themselves on opposite sides of that debate. But despite that, they got to know each other, got on very well, because they both shared this love of the mythologies of the Anglo-Saxons and Norse mythology. And so they quickly came to become close friends, even though they were on opposite sides of that debate.
And they went on to have regular meetings in a reading group, didn't they? Can you tell us something about the Coal-Biters?
So one of the things that Tolkien set up shortly after he came to Oxford was this old Icelandic reading group, which was called the Coal-Biters. It was sort of modelled on a Viking club that he'd set up at Leeds. And what he was trying to do was to promote the understanding of an ability to read Icelandic literature in the original Old Norse. And he invited Lewis to join that group. And Lewis had already fallen in love with old Icelandic literature. Even as a child, as a 13-year-old, he'd discovered the poetry of the Vikings, essentially. But he couldn't read it in the original. So this was a great opportunity for him. And Tolkien invited a number of distinguished philologists from around the university. So the professor of Celtic was a member of it, the professor of Byzantine Greek, the professor of comparative philology. So it was a pretty highbrow get-together. And they essentially were set chunks of sagas or poems to translate in advance. And then they turn up at the meeting, and Tolkien would kind of help them through, essentially.
And how did that Coal-Biter group become the Inklings?
Well, it didn't directly, in the sense that Lewis was going to lots of sort of reading groups, discussion groups. Pretty much every night he went to something. So he set up the Michaelmas Club here in Magdalen, which was a kind of philosophical debating society. He was going to the Socratic Club, a kind of religious debating group. And he had Beer and Beowulf with his undergraduate students. And the Inklings itself started off as a group at University College, which is where Lewis had been an undergrad. And he and Tolkien were invited along as senior members, but it was essentially an undergraduates reading group where they read their own compositions to each other and commented on it. And it kind of fizzled out because it was being led by undergraduates who left the university. And then the Inklings itself started, borrowed the name from that group, and it was really centred around Lewis himself and Tolkien, who was a particularly close friend by that point, and their other friends and associates, not necessarily all members of the university, but connected with it, and many with the same kinds of interests. And it became a kind of group for sharing work in progress and commenting on it.
So what do you think a meeting of the Inklings would have been like? Because we are actually sitting here in the new building where they met, in very much a room very similar to where they met every week.
That's right, yeah. So they would have turned up, I think, about 9:00. And it began with Lewis essentially saying, who's got something to read? And then somebody would begin by just reading a section of something that they had been working on. If it was Tolkien, it was likely the next instalment of The Lord of the Rings, or the new Hobbit book, as Lewis always referred to it. In Lewis's case, he read them The Problem of Pain and his science fiction works, The Out of the Silent Planet, Perelandra, The Great Divorce. And essentially they went round the room and read a bit and then made comments on each other's work. It would often lead into other kinds of discussion on sort of themes that had emerged, even though they were quite different, many of the contributions. So Warnie Lewis, Lewis's brother, was a member and wrote 17th century French history. Lewis's family doctor, Humphrey Havard, was an Inkling, and would give accounts of his latest mountaineering holiday. And you wonder how they managed to find common themes with this, but that's seemingly what happened. And this would go on quite often until quite late in the night.
So you hold Lewis's position now at the college as Professor of English Language and Literature. What aspects of Lewis's interests in medieval literature and earlier literature did he share with Tolkien in particular?
Well, both Lewis and Tolkien were interested in medieval literature, broadly conceived. So Tolkien had the chair of Anglo-Saxon literature and was particularly engaged with the Anglo-Saxon epic poem Beowulf. It's a work that he was involved in translating. His translation's only recently been published. He gave a very important lecture about Beowulf, which kind of stimulated lots of new work on as a poem. And so that was a work that Lewis himself would have been teaching regularly. He had his Beer and Beowulf sessions with his undergraduate students. And you can see that certainly influencing both of their fiction. I mean, it's the most obvious, I suppose, in The Hobbit, because it's the story of a dragon sitting on a treasure hoard. Somebody steals a cup from the treasure. He takes out his vengeance on the local town, burning it down, and then Beowulf has to come and kill the dragon. And it's clear echoes there of the events at the end of The Hobbit. And they both would have taught widely across the Middle Ages. So Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, an Arthurian poem, which Tolkien himself edited. The edition that he edited is still one that we use today with students. And there's a nice copy of it that survives with Lewis's own copy of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight in the Bodleian Library, heavily annotated. You can see his reactions to some of Tolkien's editorial decisions, not always favourable. And so that, again, is a work that you can see cropping up in both of their fictions, particularly in the Narnian stories, I suppose, where Arthurian literature has an important part to play.
And now over to Colin Duriez to tell us about his fascination with Tolkien.
Well, it all started when I was in grammar school. We in one of the classes we were reading around C.S. Lewis's book Mere Christianity. I'd never heard of C.S. Lewis, and I was gripped by his style. I wanted to read all his books, and it was through him that I came across the name Tolkien. And that interested me because I've got a French surname, and I thought, he's somebody with a Germanic surname. That's interesting. And then, of course, The Hobbit appeared, and I read that. And then I went off to Istanbul for 2 years, the University of Istanbul. And it's there that I read the Lord of the Rings, borrowed the books from the British Council Library. And that's where it all started. And I started writing articles, an article on Tolkien, and which I called Leonardo, Tolkien and Mr. Baggins. Mm-hmm. And I'd given it as a talk, and I did as kind of an essay as part of my course at the university. and then it was sent. I met somebody who was from an American university, and he was just there for a year. A transfer over the two, and he sent it off. He said, "Could I send it off to Clyde Kilby in Merton College, who had met Tolkien, had spent a summer with him actually, to help him when he was working on the Silmarillion and that, and Clyde Kilby asked if he could send it on to California because there was lots of interest in Tolkien there. It was kind of hippie era, and it appeared in a fanzine basically about Tolkien, which was a very interesting one, and that was my first big article on Tolkien, and that's where it all started. And then since then I've written quite a few books on Tolkien and his friend C.S. Lewis, and I've also veered towards Harry Potter and others, but I just very much like fantasy writing, and that was something that drew me in. And one of the earliest books I wrote was on the friendship between Tolkien and Lewis, which interested me greatly. And Tolkien, after the First World War, he came back to Oxford. And he worked for a while on the big English dictionary. I think it was called the English Dictionary. I can't remember the exact name that it had, but he was given to work on the W section of it, and which I think he enjoyed very much, and was very much akin to his knowledge of philology and the history of words. It was very much his delight to do that. And after that, he got a job as a professor at Leeds University, where he very much enjoyed teaching the students, and after a while he then got a professorship in Anglo-Saxon here in Oxford, to Pembroke College, and it was a year after that he met C.S. Lewis, who had not long after Tolkien had started as a don at Magdalen College, teaching English, and he also taught some philosophy and other subjects, but English was his great love, especially going back to medieval literature. And he also was very knowledgeable through his study on classics, and he was very wide read. And but they met at an English tea, as it was called, here in Merton College, to talk about teaching English at the university, presumably, and so that's where Lewis started chatting with Tolkien, and afterwards he quite liked him, and he thought he was okay, but he needed a kind of a slap or so, and then he would be all right.
Yes, so it had an interesting way of interacting with each other, didn't they?
That's
yes.
Right.
So how did the Inklings come about? What was the origin of that group?
Well, it grew over a period. It eventually started off from friends that knew each other. Some of them were friends that Lewis had made as an undergraduate, and there came a point when there was a group of students that started a group called the Inklings. One of them was the brother of a famous filmmaker, but anyway, they were. And it was a very mixed group of people. They weren't all just Oxford dons or professors and so on. They were a mix, and they weren't all teaching the same subject. They weren't all, say, teaching English literature, but various subjects. And for example, one of the early members of the group was C.S. Lewis's GP, which was Dr. Humphrey Havard. Well, the Humphrey was a nickname from one of the other Inklings, which happened a lot. They liked to play around with words all the time. That was part of it. They loved talking. And another idea behind it was a lot of them were starting to write. I mean, Owen Barfield, for example, had written a number of things, very important books. And also, there was a lot of conversation about what people were writing. They would give feedback to it, rather like a writers' club that we have in this country and places, which are very helpful. I know when I lived in Leicester, I went to an excellent writers' club, and I learned a lot from it because I was writing in a variety of kind of books, and I would get feedback, and I can understand why the Inklings was so attractive to young scholars, or people that were entering into the academic world or into a teaching world or whatever, and would gain a lot from it. So it wasn't until about 1933 that the Inklings were given that name. Well, actually, the name was never printed anywhere, but that seems to be when the name started anyway. So it grew out of friendship, and Lewis was very, and it was very much around C.S. Lewis. There's a rather amusing letter that Charles Williams, during the wartime, when he had to come to Oxford, as an evacuee in a sense, working for Oxford University Press, and he would write quite a lot of letters to Dorothy L. Sayers, who was a friend of hers, and Lewis said that she knew nothing about the Inklings, but in one of the letters, Williams talked about the group being like a court of the king, and the king, of course, was C.S. Lewis. And it was quite amusing to have the Inklings described in that way. And there's lots of different ways that you can describe them. But the fact is that they were real human beings. They were interacting as friends, and they and there was one or two bumps in it. For example, Hugo Dyson, who was one of the important members of the group, he rather disliked The Lord of the Rings, and Tolkien was reading many chapters from the Lord of the Rings as it was being written, and Dyson didn't like it at all, and he had a veto to stop people just talking about elves and fairies and things like that. And it was quite funny. Well, on one occasion, Dyson was late arriving, which was quite something that happened quite a lot, and they got down to listening to Tolkien reading another chapter, and a very important section where everybody was following it, and Dyson burst into Lewis's rooms, and immediately the veto came into. Well, they stopped listening to Tolkien. Had to stop. and then they got on with. So they were a very, they were a very interesting group of people, and there came a time when they stopped reading and they continued discussion groups in pubs. So it became more of a conversational group after that. Although there was lots of conversation at the time when the reading was done by various people as well, centered around what had been read. And the conversational side of the group is just as important as the reading, in my view, anyway. Having researched as much as I could.
So, what do you think the Inklings meant to Tolkien? Do you think he would have written his works without it?
I think they were very important to him. I think to have a listenership to what he was writing, because he knew he was going into ground that was, he knew that in the medieval period people would have fantasy and supernatural beings and so on, but it was a very different world that he was in, and to have a group of people that listened to him and responded to it, and at the time when his book came out, his friend C.S. Lewis wrote some blurb about it, and Tolkien actually was a bit worried in case. I think Lewis was a bit worried because he thought that maybe some people who didn't like him, it might have a bad effect on Tolkien's book. But so,
if there was one thing by Tolkien everyone should read, what do you think? Where would you start?
What age are you referring to?
An adult.
Adults. I think they should start reading The Hobbit.
That's quite a good. It was a bit contentious, is it? Do you start with Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit? Because The Hobbit, being a children's book, can put people off.
Yeah, it is. That's the first book of Tolkien I read as soon as I'd got hooked via Lewis. I saw The Hobbit in the W.H. Smiths and bought it. And when I was travelling to Istanbul, I was reading it on the journey. And I just fell in love with it. And then I found that it led to the Lord of the Rings, and that was the next step. So in terms of starting, it's a difficult question, but the fact is that the films by Peter Jackson have encouraged many people to read. I think the sales of the Lord of the Rings have gone up quite a bit since those films came out. I mean, some people didn't like the films. I remember when I was walking through a street in Leicester, I belonged to a small Tolkien group.
My name is Owen Barfield, and I'm the grandson of the other Owen Barfield, who some people know as the first and last Inkling. So Owen Barfield was one of the 4 principal Inklings, and I'm the only grandchild. And I was 28 years old when grandfather passed away, so I knew him well.
So tell us a little bit about your grandfather and his... And next we have Owen Barfield, who shares the same name as his grandfather, Owen Barfield, who was the first of the Inklings.
So he was an undergraduate here. But he was an independent scholar, I think would be the words people use now. So his life was very much led in 3 parts. The first part as a poet author, the middle part as a lawyer family man, and then as the final part as the professor. But his professorship, although he was lined up to have a role in academia here at Oxford, he was blackballed, and instead he was a visiting professor in America, a series of American universities.
And what was his academic interest?
Well, his theme was the evolution of consciousness. So that was the big theme. And the way he particularly studied it is the history of language and the use of language. In fact, his second published book was History in English Words.
So how did your grandfather get involved with the Inklings?
Well, he would say that they got involved with him, because he would consider himself the first Inkling, if you like. He was 15 years old at school, in Highgate School, sat in a Latin class with his best friend Cecil Harwood, and they were translating a Latin verse, and there was a word that literally meant death, but Cecil translated it as walking out of life. And in that moment, grandfather realized that by studying language, you can see the evidence for an evolution of consciousness. And from there, he built up his philosophy, Barfieldian philosophy.
So what kind of contribution did he make to the Inklings? What did he read to them?
Well, he made all sorts of contributions, but first of all, his interest was music and dance. And people don't associate the Inklings with music and dance, but that's where grandfather first got involved. And so here we need to bring in Maud, grandmother. So she was organising a dance tour of Cornwall, folk dance tour of Cornwall. And she asked for volunteers, grandfather volunteered, and that's how they met. And during 2 summers, they toured Cornwall with this folk music and dance show. But they also brought it to Oxford. And so in that year which they brought it to Oxford, which I think is 1922, November, that's when I would say the Inkling impulse entered Oxford. It started from there. And Maud, of course, was a great friend of C.S. Lewis and a supporter of grandfather's work.
So as we have the grandson here, can you tell us any of your own memories of your granddad? What was he like as a person?
Well, I liked being with him. So from about the age of 14 or so, I prefer to go by myself to visit him than with my parents. Maybe you want to put some distance to your parents, but they would go one weekend on a Sunday, and then I'd wait and I'd go the alternative month, if you like. So every sort of couple of months I'd go and visit, usually on a Sunday, to have lunch and then tea with him. We'd walk around, walk in the countryside, walk around the garden of the sort of residential home that he was living in later on. And conversations, tea drinking was always a part of the visit. And for me, he was really just grandfather. I was never aware of him being an Inkling or his Inkling interests or his philosophy. So I think grandfather compartmentalized his life, as many people do, and I was in the family compartment. So, for example, I was his executor with my father, but everything to do with his literary estate, he'd appointed 4 literary executors. So we weren't to get involved with that. It was only much later, when I felt the literary executors were no longer doing anything, that I started to ask questions and take an interest in grandfather's work. So for me, grandfather was first and foremost, a man I like to be with.
Thank you. And last, we have Alicia Smith to introduce us to that strangest of the Inklings, Charles Williams.
And my interest in the Inklings goes back to childhood. I read Lewis and Tolkien like many people. But I then, when I was doing my English degree, my first degree here, I got the opportunity to write an extended essay on the Inklings, which was a lot of fun. And that's where I encountered not only more of Lewis and Tolkien's work than I'd read as a child, but also Charles Williams's work, his novels primarily, and some of his poetry, what I read at that time. So that's my interest. I worked particularly on their attitudes to academia and to work and community, which was really interesting preparation for doing graduate studies myself in the university.
So tell us about Charles Williams. Who was he, first and foremost? Where did he come from?
So he had a bit of a different background to some of the other Inklings, although they are a very varied group, so that's maybe not much to say. He was a publisher. He worked for Oxford University Press all his working life. He didn't have a university degree. That made him quite different to the rest of them, but he was a very intelligent person, self-taught in large part, a very kind of literate, full of quotations, very like Lewis. And he, alongside his publishing work, lectured and wrote various kinds of literature and criticism. He was often published as a reviewer and a critic. Lewis and he sort of met because they wrote each other fan mail. Essentially, their letters congratulating each other on recent novels kind of almost crossed in the post. And then when the war broke out, Williams moved up to Oxford with OUP and became quite a core part of the Inklings at that time. So met a lot of the rest of that group.
So what was his first entry to the Inklings? How was he connected?
Primarily through Lewis, his friendship with Lewis. Lewis really liked him, possibly more than some of the other members of the group. Williams tended to be quite a divisive personality. He was very vivid. People often liked him at first meeting. But he could be a challenging person as well, by all accounts. But he was quite he was quite a central part of the Inklings for the years that he was in Oxford, until he sadly died quite young, not long after that.
He's been called the most extraordinary of the Inklings. If there was one thing by him that you would suggest people read, what would you point them to?
I think I'd recommend his novel Descent into Hell, which is very strange. Be prepared for a strange novel, but it's an astonishing meditation on what creativity and community meant to Williams and could mean in a kind of theological way, as well as being a sort of thriller. One of the characters is dead throughout the whole novel. There are sort of doppelgangers and ghosts and all kinds of things going on. It's a really interesting kind of one of his supernatural thrillers, as they're often called.
Thank you for listening.
Thanks for listening to Mythmakers podcast, brought to you by the Oxford Centre for Fantasy. Visit oxfordcenterforfantasy.org to join in the fun. Find out about our online courses, in-person stays in Oxford, plus visit our shop for great gifts. Tell a friend and subscribe wherever you find your favourite podcasts worldwide.